So, this week we're back with Moses. Last week we were with Moses at his birth, and today Moses has grown into a man, and he is encountering God in the burning bush. This story is familiar to those of us who grew up in a community of faith, and if you're like me, it is one of the Bible stories that you learned as a child. There's both a wonder and a risk in returning to these Bible stories we learned as children. Now, when I think of Moses and the burning bush, I think of being in my children's Sunday school class in Charlotte, North Carolina. Short tables and small wooden chairs, coloring pages, Kool-Aid in tiny paper cups, and eating those butter cookies with the hole in the middle that you could put on your finger. You remember those? Now remember, each Bible story came with an 11 by 17 picture that came in a kit with other pictures for other Bible stories. Jonah and the whale, Joseph and his multicolored coat, Jesus calming the storm, and Adam and Eve walking in the garden. There was one of these pictures for Moses and the burning bush too. Moses standing in front of the bush that would not be consumed. Moses in awe, taking off his sandals just as God commanded, receiving the call to go to Pharaoh to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. There's wonder in that. In my little Sunday school class, we gathered around our teacher to look at this artist's rendering and to hear the story. We began to hear about this God who appears in unexpected ways, in unexpected places, and who works through human hands to rescue people from slavery. There's wonder in that, too. But there is a risk in returning to these stories we learned as children, because we learned them when we were young. We think we've learned them, and there is nothing left to learn. We know all there is to know about this story. Now, teaching Bible stories to children is one of our greatest challenges in the Christian education ministry, for none of the stories in our Bible are children's stories. Christina and I pore over children's curriculum, striving to find lessons that teach the text in a way that is appropriate for children. And many times we cannot tell all the story because children are simply not developmentally ready for the rest of that particular story. Take, for example, King David. Yes, he slew the giant Goliath. That's the story about David we heard as children. But we did not learn in our children's Sunday school classes about David and Bathsheba. That's a story for when they're a little older. That's a story for their teenage years, and developmentally, teenagers are ready to hear more of the story. Now, many of you know that I was a youth minister for about 20 years before you called me here to serve this congregation. And one of my favorite memories as a youth minister, and really as a Christian educator, comes from one of the many Bible stories that I led for middle school students. And those are 11 to 14-year-olds. It was early fall, and we were studying King David. And that particular night, we read the story of David and Bathsheba. And 1 Samuel records David as being a man after God's own heart. But when it came to this time in his life, David made some really bad decisions. He took another man's wife, he fathered a child with her, and then he had her husband killed in battle. Now, after reading the story from 1 Samuel, one of my brand new 6th grade students cried out, "But I thought David was a good guy." This was the first time she'd heard more of the story, and this was the first time she was ready to hear it. We were children once, too, contrary to what our children might believe, and we learned the children's version of many of these Bible stories. We learned what was appropriate for us to learn as children, but if we stop with the children's version, then we make the mistake of thinking that that's all there is to know, and we stop reading, we stop listening, and we stop asking questions of the text. Moses and the burning bush is one of these stories. We learned it as children. We think we know all there is to know. We think we've got the point, learned its lesson, and have exhausted the text. But we haven't exhausted the text, gotten the point, or learned all its lessons. And that's what I love about the Bible. Depending on the day you read, you'll see something you've never noticed before, ask a question you've never thought of before, or wonder about something you've never wondered about before. Our Bible is a living, breathing collection of texts. We might study it for a lifetime and still not learn all its lessons. But study it we do, because the Bible is our written authority, and because studying it and following its lessons leads us to a deeper and richer relationship with God. So, Moses, the familiar story, this murdering refugee from Egypt who grew up in the Pharaoh's court, is now a sheep herder, a shepherd. But he's not tending his own sheep, he's tending his father-in-law's sheep. He comes to Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, and he experiences the presence of God. This God even knows his name. He is personal, calls him by name, and commands him to take his shoes off, for this place is sacred because of the presence of the Holy One, and only because of the presence of the Holy One. For holiness is a quality inherent to God, not a particular place. God proceeds to identify himself. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And then God gets right to the point. I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them. This God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is both personal and compassionate. He not only notices the suffering of his people, he suffers with his people. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. This personal and compassionate God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob also chooses to work through human hands. For here is Moses' commission to go. He is committed to partnership, too. And then Moses asks a question that I think most of us would ask. Well, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Well, what does he mean, who am I that I should go? He was born a Hebrew. He survived Pharaoh's decree that every Hebrew boy born should be thrown into the Nile. And he was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter in the royal court. He knows the system. He sympathizes with the suffering of his people. He knows their plight. And he wants to, or at least he wanted to, do something about it. He simply made a very bad decision in murdering an Egyptian after seeing him beat one of the Hebrew people. For the most part, it sounds like God made a pretty good choice in Moses. Yet Moses doesn't sound so sure. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? Notice God doesn't engage Moses in the reasons he was chosen. God simply responds with, I will be with you. I will be with you. And then he tells Moses that he will bring them out of Egypt to worship on the mountain on which they are standing. In the face of such a monumental commission, God simply promises his presence, for God knows that will be enough. But this promise of presence is insufficient for Moses. It is not enough. So Moses presses on. So if I come to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, well, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God's promise of presence leaves Moses wanting. If he takes on this task, this commission, this calling, Moses wants something he can really count on, something at his beck and call, something he can control. So he asks for God's name. In essence, Moses is asking for God's authority. Moses is asking for God's power. Knowing God's name will give Moses the ability to call on the power of God when Moses chooses. Yet again, God only promises presence. I am who I am. God says to Moses, this is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. So even in answer to a request for his name, God says, I will be present with you as I choose to be present with you. This is enough for you to do what I am calling you to do. You, Moses, only need to go with the assurance that I will be with you. In this calling and commission, God's presence is enough for Moses. So what is this promise of presence, and why is it enough? Well, this has been a question for me over the years. I grew up in a family that was fairly private. And if there was a crisis, we tended to take care of our own, and the pastor was the last person we called, which may sound funny coming from somebody in a pastoral role. Now, I remember my mother being in the hospital for open heart surgery, and the pastor walking in to check on us, and I felt awkward. I didn't understand why he was there. Well, now I know that he was there, representing the people of God at New Hope Baptist Church and being the presence of Jesus. But it took me a long time to understand that. It took me a long time to begin to understand the power of presence. You know, sometimes it's simply about showing up. A little over 3 years ago, I had to share with the congregation of First Baptist Church in Greenville, South Carolina, that we felt called to serve God through Immanuel Baptist Church in Paducah, Kentucky. And sharing that information with the congregation came in stages. One stage was sharing with the church staff. I'd already shared my call to Immanuel with Frank, who was the youth minister. And Frank and I had worked together for 14 years. That's a long time. We were friends as well as colleagues, and he has daughters who are my age. And over those 14 years, I became part of their family. In fact, our families still vacation together. That's where we were a few weeks ago at Edisto. Telling Frank about our decision to come to Immanuel, it was difficult. It was difficult. The time came to tell the rest of the staff. And that time happened to fall on a Friday. Friday was Frank's day off. I had already told him. I knew he wasn't going to be there. It was okay with me. It was his day off, after all. But when I drove into the parking lot that morning, his car was there, and he was there, and he was there in the meeting, sitting beside me. He didn't say anything. He simply showed up. And I didn't know how important it was for him to be there until he was there. The power of presence. Sometimes it's simply about showing up. And I bet you have your own stories about people who showed up when you didn't even know you needed them. The power of presence. God commissions Moses to free the captives, and God's assurance is his promise of presence. I will be with you. That is enough. In our Matthew passage, Jesus commissions the disciples. It's another commission. Jesus is commissioning the disciples to go, disciple people from everywhere in the known world. A disciple is one who follows a teacher, and Jesus, the teacher, here in Matthew's gospel, is commissioning his disciples to teach. Teach them, Jesus says. Teach them about the kingdom of God. Teach them how to live as citizens in this kingdom, how to be merciful and kind and compassionate, how to be peacemakers, and how to love your enemies, and how to pray. Teach them how God's kingdom is like yeast and a mustard seed and a treasure in a field and a pearl of great value. Teach them how to be like little children. Teach them how to obey everything that I have commanded you. Jesus' assurance is his promise of presence. I am with you always. And that is enough. The promise of presence is so important that these words are the last words in Matthew's gospel. Remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. It was important for Jesus' disciples, and it is important for us as Jesus' followers in 2014. The disciples had Jesus' promise of presence, and so do we. Moses had God's promise of presence, and so do we. We are commissioned with this same promise that God had for Moses and for Jesus and his disciples. Go, free the captives, and make disciples. As you have learned how to live in God's kingdom, go and teach others. Be salt and light in a world that desperately needs to know the love of God.